I felt the moment it happened, not as a sight, not as a shift in the air, but as a soft, sinking weight inside my chest, the kind that precedes grief long before the mind understands what has been lost. And I remember standing on one of the palace's upper walkways with the glow of the hive world horizon trembling beneath the smog, when the day dimmed in a way no dusk ever had, a way that felt deliberate, personal, as though the very light above Holy Terra had paused to take a failing breath. It was subtle at first, a small softening of the golden haze that forever clung to the sky, but then it thinned further, fading in layers, like cloth being peeled away from a lantern, and the shadows pooled toward the ground as if drawn by some ancient sorrow buried deep within the world. And I knew, before the alarm stuttered awake, before the tech priests began screaming litanies of diagnostic terror, that something sacred had just faltered, something older and heavier than any living soul remembered. And though the palace trembled with distant motion, I stood utterly still, listening to the quiet that unfurled across Terra like a black veil. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. It was not night, not truly. The stars did not reveal themselves through the haze, nor did darkness fall with the clean certainty of an eclipse. This was something else, a dimming from within the light itself, as though the sun remembered a wound it had hidden for millennia and had finally grown too weary to disguise its pain. And in that moment, the world around me felt impossibly fragile, like a relic touched by unclean hands. Yet beneath the fragility, something deeper stirred, something old enough to resent being seen. Below me, the pilgrims milling in the lower courtyards froze mid-prayer, heads lifting in fearful unison as the light that had crowned Terra since before their ancestors learned to speak receded into a muted, bruised glow. Their candles, once drowned by the brilliance of the sky, flickered with sudden authority, each flame now a desperate plea pressed into the air, and their whispers, prayers, questions, tremblings of doubt, rose through the catacombs and great halls like a growing tide that longed to be answered. But there was no answer, only the quiet, a planetary quiet, the kind that rings not in the ears but in the bones, the kind that feels like standing atop a gravesite older than memory itself. I moved through the corridors as the dimming deepened, past guards who did not meet my eyes and servitors whose optics flickered in confused patterns, their machine spirits unsettled by the failing rhythm pouring through the air. Even the golden watchers, those silent sentinel statues carved in the image of duty incarnate, seemed to glimmer with an unnatural stillness, as if some unseen frost had crept across their gilded forms. Tech priests chanted harder, their voices sharp with the terror of losing something they had never believed could falter. I passed one archmagos with trembling mechadendrites, his chant stumbling as though his binary prayers could not find the machine god's ear through the thickening hush. The quiet was everywhere. It seeped into stone, into breath, into memory. I began to feel as though I were walking not through the imperial palace, but through the echo of a palace, a place remembering itself through fading light. And in that stillness, I felt Terra's heartbeat slow. It had always been there, rhythmic, seismic, the deep, patient pulse of a world bearing the weight of uncountable lives and a throne that devoured souls. But now it fluttered unsteady, like a candle pulled toward a descending shadow. As I reached a balcony overlooking the outer districts, the change became impossible to deny. The spires of the hive Palatina, normally spearing upward with arrogant luminosity, were swallowed in a haze of dim bronze, their glimmer reduced to the faint sigh of dying embers. Airships drifted uncertainly, their pilots scrambling to adjust to the failing illumination. Some halted entirely, uncertain whether the sky still belonged to them. Long highways of light, woven from billions of lumen lamps, flickered in waves like the shimmering skin of a dying serpent. And far, far beyond the hives, across oceans no one living had ever touched, across mountain ranges drowned beneath millennia of industry, I felt the silence deepen, expanding like a tide whose coming had been foretold in a language no one remembered how to translate. The sun was still there. It had not died, but something had changed in the quality of its gift, something fundamental, something sacred. And I, for reasons I could not yet name, could sense that Terra itself had known this moment would one day arrive. My breath misted in the cooling air, an impossible occurrence atop the palace spires, each exhale drifting like a fragile ghost into the heavy twilight. I touched the railing, feeling the stone's ancient warmth fading beneath my gloved palm. I whispered a prayer I had not spoken since childhood, one of the old ones, a fragment of scripture from a small shrine swallowed long ago by a forge hive expansion. And as the words passed my lips, I felt the planet shudder softly, as though acknowledging the memory. Below, some of the pilgrims began to weep, their bodies hunched against the weight of a dread they could not name. Others lifted their hands toward the dimming sky, as if willing the Emperor's radiance to return. But the Emperor remained silent, the throne's faint psychic hum somehow muted, as though even that sacred agony had been wrapped in shrouds. And in that eerie, endless twilight, I felt something else stirring beneath the quiet, a presence vast and mournful, deep within the bedrock of Terra, older than the palace, older than humanity's claim, something that had once known dawn intimately and now mourned its faltering glow. I felt the first whisper of its sorrow brush against my thoughts, not as sound, not as command, but as a feeling. Remember me. And though I did not yet understand who or what spoke, I knew with cold certainty that Terra had begun to remember something long buried, and that I was somehow being asked to remember it too. The stillness did not descend all at once. It crept, subtle and deliberate, sliding through the arteries of Terra like a cold breath exhaled from the stone itself. And as I stood beneath the bruised half-light that had replaced the familiar glare of the sun, I felt the silence reach me the way frost reaches a window pane, first as a suggestion, then as a spreading certainty, a crystalline weight forming in places once warmed by continuity and motion. It began in the hives, though no one could have said exactly where. One moment the great manufactorums roared with ceaseless toil, and the next their rhythms stuttered, machines hesitating as though they sensed an invisible hand hovering above the kill switch of creation. Great pistons, accustomed to slamming downward in thunderous cadence, fell still mid-stroke. Conveyor belts shuddered to a halt. Furnaces dimmed into impotent simmering, their flames shrinking as though in fear of the dark. The tech priests scrambled once more through aisles of metal colossi, their chants rising frantic and discordant. But even their machine prayers faltered, their binary litanies dissolving into static as though the motive force itself refused to acknowledge them. The sound of industry, the heartbeat of Terra, had always been deafening, but now the absence of that roar felt heavier, more oppressive, as if silence itself were a weight pressing upon the world's shoulders. I walked among the outer walkways of the palace, watching the stillness ripple outward like frost creeping along old stone. Air that had always been warm with exhaust and human breath now carried a faint chill, and the smog, normally swirling restlessly above the hives, hung motionless, suspended in a reluctant sky. Even the wind had fallen quiet. I had never realized how alive the wind was on Terra, even beneath the suffocating haze. There was always the sigh of it slipping between spires, always the trembling hum of banners fluttering under the sun's oppressive glare, always noise. But not now. The banners hung limp, heavy as wet cloth. The air felt thick, weighted with a quiet so total that I could hear the faint ticking of the palace's ancient stones settling, a sound I had not noticed in all my years among these walls. And with this stillness came a strange feeling, one that burrowed beneath my armor and lodged itself against my ribs. Terra was listening. Not the emperor, not the throne, not the legions of machine spirits that haunted every lumen and gate. Terra itself. The world beneath my feet, the cradle and grave of humanity, had fallen into a hush so profound that its attention felt almost physical, as though the planet's vast consciousness, buried under millennia of industry, war, prayer, and hope, had surfaced to press its ear against the breaths of its billions. I felt exposed beneath that awareness, as though every thought I carried, every memory, every regret, resonated faintly into the stone beneath me like vibrations drifting into an ancient and patient mind. Pilgrims filled the courtyards below in greater and greater numbers, their panic evolving into a strange reverence, as if the dimming of the sun were a holy omen rather than a catastrophe. Some cried openly, clutching relics or icons to their chests. Others knelt in perfect stillness, bowing so deeply their foreheads touched the freezing marble. A few whispered prayers so softly that their words resembled breaths more than language. None of them seemed to understand what had changed, but they all felt it. The shift, the listening, the way their small lives suddenly felt unbearably loud in the heavy quiet. A child near the base of the staircase tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking why the sky felt so heavy. And though she hushed him with shaking hands, I watched her glance upward with a fear she could not disguise. And high above them, the custodes on their balconies stood as motionless as the statues beside them, their golden armor dimmed to a dull, sunless glow. Even they felt the frost of silence spreading, though they would never admit it. The deeper I walked into the palace's interior, the more the frost took hold. Servitors stood idle in their alcoves, blinking slowly as though waiting for commands they could no longer hear. Data scrolls rustled softly in the draftless air, their parchment shifting without wind, as if reacting instead to the breath of the planet itself. The illumination crystals that lined the hallways dimmed to a muted amber reminiscent of candlelight, and for the first time in centuries, those grand, vaulted passageways felt like tomb corridors, magnificent and reverent, yet unmistakably made for remembering the dead. But the dead were not the ones calling now. Something else was stirring. I found myself drawn toward the lower levels of the palace, toward an ancient section rarely traversed by anyone who had not lived a lifetime in service. The walls there were older, built from stone whose origins predated even the unification wars. And there, in that forgotten place where the air tasted dry and cold, I felt it most distinctly, a slow, rhythmic pulse rising from the ground. Not the deep, seismic heartbeat of terror that I had always sensed beneath the din of daily life. No, this was different, softer, older, finer in grain, like the pulse of a creature waking from impossibly long sleep. The stone beneath my boots thrummed with fragile resonance, as if remembering something vast and sorrowful. And when I placed my gloved hand against the cold wall, I felt a tremor move through it, not physical, not seismic, but emotional, like the echo of a gasp or the shadow of a sigh. Something ancient beneath Terra's surface was stirring in the silence, something that remembered light, something that grieved its fading, something that listened not to our prayers but to our fear. In that moment, I understood why the stillness felt like frost. It was not simply the absence of warmth, but the presence of something waiting beneath the surface of the world. Something patient, something mournful, something that had finally noticed the quiet falling over its skin. And as my breath misted in the chilled air, I whispered into the silence without meaning to, words not meant for the emperor or the throne or any god I had ever been taught to serve. I hear you. And the stone answered with a shiver that felt almost like relief. The night did not fall in a single sweep of darkness. It arrived the way grief arrives, first as an interruption, a hesitation in the light, then as a gradual surrender, until even the idea of dawn felt like a memory worn thin from being repeated too often. I stood at the threshold between the upper corridors and the old stone vaults below, and in that liminal place I felt the world narrowing into shadow, a shadow not cast by anything, but from within the light itself, as though the sun's glow had begun to hollow out, collapsing inward like an exhausted lung. The dimness seeped through the air with a strange deliberation, filling every crevice, every corner, every breath, and though the lumen strips along the palace walls flickered in defiant gold, their glow felt performative, brave, but ultimately insufficient against the widening dark that had chosen Terra as its cradle. Even the throne's distant psychic thrum grew faint, a muffled heartbeat smothered beneath thick blankets of silence, and for the first time since childhood, I realized how dependent I had been on that subtle, omnipresent hum. To feel it weaken was to feel the ground tilt underfoot, as if gravity itself were reconsidering its loyalties. Outside, the sky no longer resembled sky. It was a stretched canvas of ashen gold, thinning into bruised blue and muted violet, a color that felt less like dusk and more like the world's eyelids slowly closing. The hives, those jagged mountains of metal that scraped the heavens, glowed faintly in the gloom, their windows like scattered embers fading in a hearth long abandoned. Traffic that usually roared in the upper atmosphere grew sparse, and the vessels that remained moved cautiously, their running lights dimmed as if to avoid attracting the attention of something unseen. Pilgrims who had once crowded the plazas seeking blessings now huddled together beneath the great arches, their rosary beads clattering softly in trembling hands, the sound echoing strangely in the vast emptiness. I wondered if any of them felt what I did, the weight of a gaze pressed against the back of the world, patient and curious, as if watching from behind a veil terraforming itself from light to shadow. I moved through the halls with steps that felt too loud, each footfall a disruption in a silence that had begun to feel sacred, and every sound produced by living hands. A dropped candle holder, a whispered prayer, the clink of armor seemed almost inappropriate, as though breaking some unspoken vow not to disturb whatever ancient consciousness had risen beneath the surface of Terra. And as I walked, the shadows did not simply grow. They deepened, acquiring texture, weight, presence. They no longer drifted in the corners. They gathered, pooling along the seams where floor met wall, where vault met pillar, where memory met forgetting. Yet there was no malice in their movement, only attention, like creatures approaching the edge of sleep, listening with eyes half open. It was not long before the lumens faltered completely. One by one, in long cascading lines, they dimmed into a muted, flickering gold, then extinguished entirely, leaving only the faint, eerie glow of the palace's runic inscriptions to paint the walls in soft, ghost-like ribbons of light. Those runes, etched by forgotten artisans in the earliest days of the Imperium, shone with a color I had never seen, cold, pale, like moonlight reflecting off deeply buried ice. Their light did not push back the dark. It coexisted with it, as though the two had made ancient peace. And beneath the glow, I felt the trembling pulse within the stone tighten, as if the world were bracing for something, pulling breath into its depths. As I descended toward the Hall of Echoes, an old, unfrequented chamber where the palace kept relics too insignificant for worship, yet too ancient to discard, I noticed that the chill settling into the air no longer felt like weather. It felt like memory, a coldness shaped by recollection rather than temperature, the kind that carried the weight of ages. And in that coldness, the whispering pulse returned, threading itself through the stone like a voice attempting speech through the slow movement of tectonic plates. I felt its longing before I understood its content, a yearning so heavy, so old, that it pressed against my heart with the same pressure as grief. And with it came the unmistakable awareness. This night was not merely absence of sun. It was the awakening of something Terra had not allowed itself to feel for a very long time. I entered the Hall of Echoes with a reverence I had not expected to feel. Its vaulted ceiling loomed like the ribcage of some colossal ancestor, and the relics within lay half forgotten in dust-covered alcoves. But what struck me was not the sight, it was the sound. The silence here was different, dense, resonant, humming faintly with the memory of old prayers. As I stepped deeper into the hall, the pulse beneath the stone aligned with my footsteps, as though the world listened to the rhythm of my approach. When I stopped, the pulse stopped, and in that stillness someone exhaled, not in the air, not in my mind, in the stone, a soft, trembling sigh like a planet remembering pain. The eternal night had not fallen from the sky. It had risen from the heart of Terra itself, unfolding upward, swallowing the light not with hunger but with mourning. And for the first time I felt the truth that had been stirring beneath the hush. Terra was not simply falling into darkness. Terra was grieving. And I, for reasons I did not yet dare to name, was being asked to grieve with it. They came like a slow tide, not in the violent surge of panicked mobs, but in the patient, disciplined flow of those who had been taught to wait on faith as if waiting were a sacrament. And as I watched them assemble in the great plazas beneath the palace, faces upturned, hands clasped, candles trembling in cupped palms, I felt the enormity of what they offered. Not protest, not anger, but a surrender so total it became its own kind of defiance. a refusal to let the world fall into meaninglessness without answering with devotion. The pilgrims arrived in columns that wound between the hive spires like rivers of cloth and flesh, each small light a commitment that the night would be met with unbroken ritual. They knelt on the cold stone, shoulder to shoulder, their breath wreathing in the thin, unnatural air, and from their mouths rose the soft sound of litanies, phrases polished by generations of repetition, turned outward like shields against the unknown. I walked among them and heard personal prayers braided into public ones, names whispered for sons at the front, pleas for harvest when no sun would warm the fields, quiet confessions muttered into talismans as if to anchor the speaker to something steadfast. The smell of wax and smoke and old incense saturated the plazas so thoroughly that even those who had never knelt learned the scent as a language of hope. It clung to robes and hair, to the edges of banners, to the very stone, threading its way into the architecture, until the palace itself seemed to breathe prayer. There was a dignity to their waiting that made my own presence feel voyeuristic. I was a witness to an intimacy the world rarely permitted in public, people willing themselves to remain small and faithful when the cosmos offered no instruction. Yet beneath that devotion ran a current of fear, the kind that smooths faces into masks of resolve. Occasionally, a father would press his forehead into a child's crown and murmur something frantic and hollow, or a veteran of 1,000 campaigns would let his hands fall away from his rosary and stare at the dimming sky with eyes that had finally admitted uncertainty. These contradictions, faith braided with panic, ritual holding the seam of terror, made the whole scene unbearably fragile, as though one gust of false comfort might scatter the congregation into raw despair. The priests performed grand rites at the temple steps, their voices amplified by sacred acoustics until the words rolled over the plaza like distant surf. They called for the emperor's mercy, for the machine god's guidance, for the throne to remember its charge, and their liturgies filled the air with a kind of liturgical armor meant to ward off quiet. But ritual, when the world itself has altered its rhythm, can feel at once immense and impotent. The priest's words rang out, beautifully rehearsed and desperate, and yet the crowd's murmured responses grew thinner, as if some part of them recognized that no chant could compel a star to give what it had decided to withhold. Candles multiplied into a sea of small suns, a defiant mimicry of the absent day, and in their fragile light I saw faces transform from devout certainty to something resembling private negotiation, people bargaining with the universe in the old-fashioned currency of hope. I moved through the rows, feeling the weight of their petitions like warm stones pressed into the palms of my hands. Strangers passed their burdens to me in the form of glances or gestures, and I found myself collecting them involuntarily, a quiet repository for grief I had not intended to hold. Children who understand nothing of cosmic essays or throne politics found their own ways to make meaning. They blew on frozen breaths and watched small lights float like ghosts before them, naming them after pets, after distant relatives, after the tiny things that make a life. Their small, defiant inventiveness gave the ritual a different shape, not a public spectacle but a private conversation with darkness, coaxing it into returning what it had taken. The elders, women and men weathered by plague and siege and old loss, sat in silent rows, their hands knotted in prayer, lips moving with fragments of prayer songs that had been sung when the world was still bright. Occasionally, one of them would laugh, a brittle sound, at the absurdity of offering incense to the sky, and the laughter would ripple through the crowd like a flinch of warmth. There were moments of solidarity that felt more holy than any sermon. A stranger sharing a blanket despite having none to give, a soldier handing his ration to a woman with trembling hands, an old man teaching a child the correct way to hold a candle so its flame would be least likely to gutter. Small acts as profound as any scripture. Yet as hours stretched into cycles and cycles blurred into a single elongated night, strain began to show. The candles, though many, were weak against the encroaching cold, their flames bent under drafts that should not have been so bitter, and the priest's chants, repeated without pause, began to fray at the edges. Whispers of doubt slipped into the litanies like a salt taste. Why had the throne not intervened? Why had the golden chamber fallen mute? Some asked aloud if this was judgment, others if it was silence as mercy, a test of faith so severe that only the purest supplicant could pass. Rumors grew, about conspiracies in the palace, about sabotage, about the world dying as punishment or penance. And with rumors came small violences, a scuffle over a shared blanket, a fist raised at someone whose prayers sounded too blasphemous, a child stolen away by a man who insisted on the primacy of his own loss. In that crucible of waiting, virtue and vice pressed against one another until the fabric of communal faith threatened to rend. I found myself torn between admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the steadfastness of people who preferred to pray rather than riot. Sorrow for a populace that had no other language left by which to interpret disaster. As the nights multiplied, so did the subtle transformations of behavior. Some began to leave their candles alit on doorsteps like beacons, trusting that small lights spread across neighborhoods might stitch together a map of consolation. Others moved through the crowd quietly, offering bread or a hand clasp as if to transfer courage through touch alone. And yet, through all the devotional theater, there was a deeper, quieter phenomenon at work, the slow accrual of memory. Terra, in its listening, seemed to gather not only noise but meaning. The prayers, the laments, the tiny acts of tender rebellion, each became a stitch in an enormous tapestry that the planet itself might be weaving into a language of response. I do not claim to be naive. I knew that piety could calcify into fanaticism, and that waiting without agency can harden people into stations of blame. But I also understood a different truth as I watched thousands lean into the night with their palms open. There is dignity in choosing to attend to the vulnerable world rather than exploit it. The Pilgrims were not helpless so much as present, and presence in the face of cosmic silence is a kind of courage older than empires. That courage, fragile as it was, might be the only ballast Terra had left against a silence that sought to teach us how small our certainties had ever been. The first time I noticed the shadows moving with intention, I told myself it was exhaustion, that the endless night and the weight of the Pilgrims, quiet devotion had thinned the boundary between perception and imagination. But as the dim hours stretched into one indistinguishable sheet of darkness, I realized the shadows were no longer behaving like the absence of light. They behaved like students, watching with a patience that felt almost reverent. They lengthened and contracted not with the flicker of the candles scattered across the plazas, but with the cadence of breath, as though mimicking the fragile rise and fall of human lungs. It was subtle at first, the dark at the edge of a relic stand deepening when someone knelt beside it, the silhouette cast by a pilgrim's bowed form, stretching toward a whisper of prayer rather than away from the flame, the air cooling not in drafts but in pulses. But soon the patterns became impossible to deny. The shadows were listening, not in the passive way the world had listened before, but actively, attentively, with an old hunger that did not seek to consume but to understand. I stood beneath one of the immense archways leading from the palace's lower cloisters into the open square, and watched the shadows between the marble pillars shift like ink slowly stirring in a vast basin. They did not reach for me. They did not threaten. They simply expanded and contracted in time with the murmured petitions of the pilgrims, responding, I realized, to emotion rather than sound. When someone prayed with desperation, the dark quivered, bowing inward as though trying to cradle the sorrow. When someone offered gratitude despite the cold, the shadows flickered with a faint tremor of warmth, a phenomenon so gentle it felt like an animal pressing its head into a familiar hand. And when fear rippled through the crowd, when a sudden crack in the distant manufactorum made dozens flinch, the shadows tensed, withdrawing toward the walls as if wounded. It dawned on me slowly, with the hesitance of a truth too fragile to accept all at once. The darkness had not come to punish us. It had come to learn us, to study the patterns of our rituals and the shape of our hope. Perhaps it had always been listening, but the fading of the sun had stripped away its inhibitions. Terra's night had not arrived as a conqueror. It arrived as a witness. But being witnessed by the dark is a peculiar feeling. The mind tries to categorize it: superstition, psychic phenomenon, warp echo, but none of those names fit neatly. The dark did not carry the gnawing hunger of the warp, nor the cold calculus of machine reason. It felt instead like something older, something planetary, as if the night itself were a consciousness Terra had kept locked beneath millennia of light and movement, now rising like a leviathan from the depths of a forgotten ocean. I stepped deeper into the cloister where the shadows pooled thickest, not out of bravado but out of a strange compulsion, a tug beneath the sternum, quiet and inquisitive. The air was colder there, but the cold did not bite. It settled around me like a heavy cloak, as though the night sought to understand my presence by enfolding it. And in that cold, I sensed the faintest texture of emotion, curiosity, not directed at me specifically, but at the shape of humanity itself. The night had grown attentive to the rhythms of the pilgrims, and the pilgrims, without realizing it, had begun to adjust to the night in return. Their prayers slowed, deepened. Their questions softened from pleading to confiding. The dark did not answer in words, but it responded in presence, in minute shifts of density that gave form to emotion. A woman kneeling near the archway whispered the name of her lost child into the gloom. The shadow beside her trembled, as if absorbing the sorrow with an empathy that felt almost maternal. A soldier recited a battle hymn through chattering teeth, clinging to duty as a shield against despair. The dark leaned toward him, not in threat, but in acknowledgement, as though recognizing the weight he carried. A young initiate, trembling beneath the enormity of the silence, confessed her doubt to the dim sky. The night gathered around her like protective hands cupping a flame. The priests did not notice, or rather, they noticed only enough to fear what they could not control. Their chants grew louder, sharper, filled with warnings of heresy, their eyes darting toward the shifting dim with suspicion. To them, shadows were a sign of infiltration, corruption, the creeping touch of the immaterial. They lashed incense against the columns as if trying to beat back a tide, but incense is only smoke dressed in ritual, and the shadows absorbed its scent like memory rather than retreating. When one priest stabbed a sacred stave into the ground, shouting that darkness could not speak the emperor's name, the shadow nearest him did not recoil, it stilled. It listened, and that stillness frightened him more than any motion could have. The pilgrims sensed the tension. A murmur of unease passed through them like a ripple across still water. Some wondered whether the night had come to test their faith. Others wondered whether their faith had called it forth. But most, I think, simply felt watched, not judgefully, not cruelly, but intimately, the way a parent watches a child sleep after a nightmare. It was then, while the plaza lay suspended between terror and reverence, that the night revealed something new, not through sound, not through form, but through memory. A wave of emotion rolled through the darkness, gentle but undeniable, brushing against the minds of everyone present. A feeling of ancient warmth, of dawns forgotten, of a sun rising before the first shrine had ever been built. It was a memory not of despair, but of mourning for something long lost, a grief so expansive and old that it made human sorrow feel like a single raindrop falling into the ocean. Terra's night was remembering. And through that remembering, it asked us quietly, tenderly, if we remembered too. It was not an accusation, not a demand, but a question offered with the softness of a hand reaching out in shared loss. The pilgrims felt it. I saw their faces shift from fear to something rawer, something nearer to understanding. A few wept openly. A few smiled with aching tenderness. A few clasped the hands of strangers without knowing why. It wasn't communion. It wasn't worship. It was recognition. The shadows had learned to listen, and in return, the people of Terra had begun to remember how to be heard. As I stepped back into the open plaza, the night pressed close, not consuming but companioning, watching, waiting, and I understood with a clarity as sharp and fragile as thin glass that whatever was coming next would not be a battle to endure but a truth to witness. And I had been chosen not by fate or by the throne, but by the listening night itself. It happened so quietly that at first I mistook it for the sound of my own pulse, an internal rhythm distorted by fatigue, or else the faint rasp of breath echoing inside my helm. But as I stepped deeper into the dimming world, I realized the sound was not within me at all. It came from below, from far, far beneath the palace's foundation stones, beneath the catacombs, beneath even the oldest strata carved in the early years of unification. It was a long, slow exhale drawn out with the weight of centuries, a sound so deep it didn't travel through the air but through the stone, through the marrow, through the memory of the planet itself. I froze. The pilgrims froze. Even the shadows, which had moved with the curious attentiveness of newborn animals, stilled completely. The entire night seemed to lean in, waiting. And then, soft, impossibly soft, the inhalation followed, drawn with such aching reluctance it felt like a being stirring after a sleep it had not chosen. Terra was breathing. Of course, a rational mind might deny such things. Planets do not breathe. They orbit, they rotate, they fracture under tectonic strain, but they do not sigh like sleepers waking beneath blankets of night. And yet, what I felt was not mere metaphor. The exhalation shuddered through the stone beneath my boots, passing upward in resonant waves that trembled against the bones of my legs, then radiated outward across the plazas so gently that candles flickered not from wind, but from sympathy, their flames bowing in the direction of the unseen pulse. Each pilgrim felt it differently. Some clutched at their chests, some pressed trembling fingers to the ground, a few whispered that the emperor had spoken, but all sensed the truth beneath their interpretations. Something immense and sorrowful had stirred, something old, something that knew us. It was not the emperor. His presence, even muted, presses against the soul like a weight of incomparable density, a psychic gravity that bends thought and belief around itself. No, the breath I felt was gentler, older, more organic. The kind of presence that accumulates when countless generations have lived their tiny lives upon the same world, spilling their hopes, their fears, their quiet prayers into the soil until the soil itself becomes an archive of longing. Terra had been absorbing humanity for so long, absorbing its grief, its triumph, its ambitions, its wounds, that perhaps this was inevitable, the day when the weight of all those histories condensed into a presence capable of remembering us back. The breath rose again, an inhale longer than the last, drawn through fissures that had not stirred since before the palace was built. A deep vibration coursed outward from the horizon, traveling through the hives, making spires tremble like tuning forks. I saw banners sway to a rhythm not produced by wind, saw flocks of carrion birds lift into the air in perfect unison, as if startled by a heartbeat rather than motion. The manufactorums, silent for days now, seemed to hum faintly in response, their dormant machine spirits flickering awake with ancestral recognition. And beneath the plazas, beneath the relic chambers, beneath the countless layers of stone and ash, I felt a pulse, steady, slow, unmistakably alive. The heartbeat of Terra. No metaphor this time, no poetic flourish, a literal pulse, so vast and deep it could only be the world's own internal rhythm, long buried under the clangor of civilization. Not everyone reacted well. Some pilgrims collapsed in terror, believing the world itself was dying beneath them. A few priests shrieked warnings of abomination, declaring the sensation a warp intrusion, a false heartbeat meant to lure the faithful into damnation. They raised their staves, chanting exorcisms so frantic the words tangled on their tongues. But the shadows around them did not recoil. They simply watched, quiet and patient, as if waiting for fear to exhaust itself. The planet's next breath silenced the priests more effectively than any argument could. It resonated through the marble steps, through their trembling hands, through the metal of their staves, vibrating at a frequency that felt not invasive but clarifying. Their cries faltered. Some dropped to their knees in uncomprehending awe. Others clutched their relics as though trying to anchor themselves to the familiar in the face of a truth too ancient to categorize. I found myself stepping forward, unable to resist the pull of the sound. Each breath from Terra felt like a memory surfacing. My memory, certainly, but also not mine alone. Flashes of old sunlight drifted across my mind, scenes I did not recognize yet somehow understood. A golden dawn rising over an unbroken sea, long before the hives choked the world. vast plains untouched by war where early humans walked with cautious reverence. The first fires lit in caves older than language. And beneath those memories lay a deeper one, not human at all. A memory of being whole, unburdened, warm. A time before sorrow hardened into permanence. The planet remembered itself in fragments, and through those fragments remembered us. I pressed my palm against the stone floor of the cloister. It was cold, colder than it had ever been. But beneath that coldness ran a warmth so faint it felt like a whisper against my skin. A warmth that pulsed in time with Terra's breath. And when I leaned closer, chest nearly touching the ground, I felt something embrace me. Not physically, not psychically, but emotionally, the way a mother might wrap her arms around a child too long lost. It was a feeling so unexpected, so painfully tender that I almost recoiled from it. Humanity had given Terra suffering beyond measure, and yet the presence beneath the stone felt not angry, not vengeful, but profoundly lonely. As though it had been waiting millennia for someone to lean close enough to hear it breathe. The pilgrims felt it next. One by one, they lowered their hands to the ground, pressing their fingertips or palms or foreheads against the cold stone. Some gasped, others sobbed with relief or sorrow. Some whispered apologies, others whispered gratitude. The shadows leaned in gently, forming a protective perimeter, as if shielding the vulnerable act of listening from anything that might profane it. And through it all, Terra breathed, slowly, steadily, as though pulling the long-forgotten world of its own memory closer to the surface. I understood then that this eternal night was not punishment. It was revelation. The planet was trying to speak, and after millennia of drowning its voice beneath industry, faith, and war, humanity had finally grown quiet enough to hear it. I had always believed Terra to be unyielding, a world defined not by fragility but by endurance, an ancient sphere of stone and devotion whose suffering had long since calcified into permanence. But as the sunless hours stretched on and the breaths of the planet grew quieter, slower, more labored, I began to understand how profoundly mistaken that belief had been. Terra was enduring, yes, but it was not invincible. Beneath the hives, beneath the cathedrals, beneath the endless layers of ash from wars older than memory, the world carried wounds too deep for any surface ritual to acknowledge. And now, in the soft and suffocating quiet of this unnatural night, those wounds were no longer hidden. They pressed upward through the stone in ways I could feel but not fully name. A weight, a weariness, a sorrow that saturated the air with the heaviness of a body that has been carrying too much for far too long. As I walked through the palace's lower colonnades, each step felt like trespass, not because the halls were forbidden, though many were, but because the floor beneath my boots responded with a heaviness I had never before sensed, as though Terra itself sagged under its own accumulated history. The weight was not merely physical, it was emotional, atmospheric, almost psychic in its density. The shadows no longer moved with the curiosity they once had. They clung to the walls now, draped like mourning veils over the architecture, watching not the pilgrims but the planet itself, as if keeping vigil for something vast and precious that was slipping beyond reach. Even the air felt thicker, harder to draw into the lungs, as though the act of breathing took strength the world could no longer spare. The pilgrims, sensing this change in ways they could not articulate, shifted subtly. Their prayers softened from supplication into something more tender. Songs hummed under the breath, murmurings of reassurance meant for the stone beneath them rather than the sky above. Some reached out to touch the ground as if Terra were a fevered child needing comfort. Others leaned their bodies against pillars or steps, offering warmth in the small, instinctive gestures people make when they cannot heal what is hurting but cannot bear to look away. Yet even these acts, gentle as they were, seemed to weigh heavily on the stone, like the touch of hands against an old bruise. The priests grew frantic. Their rituals became more elaborate, more desperate, their liturgies rising in pitch and fervor as though they believed volume could stave off the tremor of planetary exhaustion. They swung censers in wild arcs, their incense clouds thick enough to sting the eyes, and chanted exorcisms over the silent air, declaring in harsh, cracking voices that Terra was under attack by forces unimaginable. But nothing was attacking. Attack implies malice. This was something far more tragic, the culmination of centuries of neglect disguised as devotion. The priests shouted until their voices failed, but the world did not respond. Their words fell into the quiet like pebbles tossed into a bottomless well, swallowed without echo. What struck me most was the sound, or the absence of it. Terra's breath, once steady in its tremors, had weakened. The exhale came as a long, shuddering vibration that rattled gently through my bones. The inhale followed predictably, but it was shallower, a little shorter than before, a rhythm losing its coherence. The world was not dying, not yet, but it was tired in a way that felt irreversible. A tiredness that had accumulated layer upon layer over millennia, like sediment pressing downward until the core itself remembered pain. And for the first time, I felt a sharp pang of fear, not for myself, not for the Pilgrims, not for the throne's guardians, but for the planet beneath us, for Terra, for the cradle of humanity that had survived cataclysmic wars, cosmic storms, heretical uprisings, and more suffering than any single world should have endured. I found myself drawn to the outer edge of the plaza where a wide fracture had appeared in the marble, thin, subtle, almost invisible except in the way the faint light caught it. I knelt beside it and placed my fingers against the crack. It was warm, too warm, as though the planet's internal heat was rising in pulses, uneven, unstable. It felt like a fever born not of sickness but of overexertion, of a body pushed beyond its limits. I closed my eyes and leaned closer, letting my forehead rest lightly against the stone. And in that posture, half supplicant, half mourner, I felt something rise beneath my skin, the sensation of Terra's exhaustion flowing upward like a plea. A wordless request not for salvation but for witness. See me. The world did not want rescue. It wanted to be known. Behind me, a child whimpered, terrified by the vibration underfoot. His mother lifted him into her arms, cradling him with a tenderness that softened the sharpness of the scene. And as she pressed her cheek against his hair, I saw the shadows gather around them. Not hungrily, but protectively, like curtains drawn around a bed to keep nightmares at bay. Even in its weakness, Terra's night comforted its own. The Pilgrims noticed the shift. Some echoed the mother's gesture, reaching for one another in hesitant unity. Strangers embraced, shoulders touched, hands brushed against hands. The fear did not vanish, but it changed shape from isolation into shared burden. And Terra, sensing this subtle reweaving of human instinct, seemed to breathe a little easier, though the breath was still shallow. I listened to the world's heartbeat again, It was uneven now, occasionally skipping a beat before correcting itself. A lump formed in my throat. The throne did not stir. The sun did not return. The emperor did not intervene. For the first time, I realized that all our rituals, all our wars, all our faith had never truly addressed the thing beneath it all. A world that had given everything and received only weight in return. Humanity had worshipped Terra as a concept, not as a living being. But now, stripped of light and noise, the truth stood uncovered. Terra was not dying because it had been attacked. Terra was dying because it had been carrying us for too long. And still, even in its exhaustion, it breathed. It reached upward. It wanted us to hear. I pressed my palm more firmly against the crack. "I am here," I whispered, not knowing whether the world could hear me, but unable to bear the weight of letting it fall alone. And in the tremor that rippled back into my hand, faint, fragile, but unmistakably responsive, I felt Terra acknowledge the words. It was enough. For now. The longer the sunless hours stretched, the more the darkness began to feel less like an absence and more like a presence, an entity with its own quiet intentions, its own slow attentiveness, its own way of leaning close without ever touching. It did not behave as shadows normally do. It did not swallow light so much as cradle it, cupping the faint glimmers of candles and lumens in soft, trembling hands. It was as if the night wished to observe us more clearly, to understand the small, fragile creatures who walked upon the surface of the world that sustained them. And as Terra's breath grew fainter, the night grew more attentive, as though listening for the dying exhale of an old friend. I walked through the plaza where the pilgrims had gathered, now fewer but quieter, their fear tempered into something reverent, and I felt the darkness adjust to my movement. It thinned beside me, then thickened behind me, not threatening, not predatory, but deliberate. The sensation was unnerving at first, not the touch of a predator, nor the hunger of the warp, that I would have felt instantly, like teeth pressing against the softest part of the soul, but something gentler, curious. The darkness moved as though afraid to break the fragile quiet that Terra's trembling breaths had drawn across the world. It listened not because it wished to intervene, but because it wished to understand why the world beneath us struggled so painfully to continue. A faint wind touched my cheek, so faint it barely disturbed the air, and carried with it the unmistakable scent of dust, old dust, the kind that clings to the stones of forgotten catacombs and the bones of empires long returned to the ground. The pilgrims shivered. Some huddled closer together. And I realized then that the darkness was gathering the scents, sounds, and quiet fragments of humanity and guiding them downward, down through the fractures, down through the stone, down into the trembling core where Terra labored to breathe, as if offering comfort, as if offering memory, as if the night itself was trying to soothe the dying world. The heartbeat below the stone faltered again, stumbling over its own rhythm. I knelt immediately, pressing my palm to the cold marble, and felt the pulse return, but weakly, as though Terra had struggled to catch itself after nearly letting go. A raw ache flared behind my ribs. There was a moment, a terrible moment, when the world seemed to sigh, not the great planetary breath from before, but a thin, fragile sound like cloth tearing under strain. Some of the pilgrims clutched their chests. A few fell to their knees, sobbing with the instinctive terror of children waking from a nightmare. But the darkness drew closer, wrapping them in a soft, cool calm that steadied their breathing. The night did not want us to panic, Panic blinds, panic fractures, and Terra in its exhaustion needed humanity to remain whole if only for this moment. I whispered again to the stone, unsure if the world could still hear me. I am here. My voice shook with something I hated to recognize: fear, helplessness, a grief large enough to eclipse duty. I had seen planets die. I had walked battlefields where entire continents were reduced to glass and ash. I had been among the last survivors of worlds too far gone to save. But Terra was different. Terra was the axis upon which all humanity revolved. Terra was memory, myth, promise, burden. The thought of it falling silent was not merely heartbreaking, it was cosmically wrong. As if sensing my spiraling thoughts, the darkness shifted. It pooled beside me like water flowing toward a low point, then rose, not physically, not in any shape that cast a true shadow, but in a sensation that pressed upward around me like hands lifting my shoulders from beneath the earth. And though it had no voice, the night spoke. Not in words, not even in emotion, but in a single, unmistakable message. Do not break. I steadied myself. I breathed deeply, matching what little rhythm remained of Terra's pulse. And slowly, blessedly, the heartbeat beneath the stone found its pattern again, still weak, still uncertain, but present. The Pilgrims felt it too. They quieted, letting the darkness settle around them like a protective cloak. Some began humming soft, tuneless melodies, instinctive, childlike songs that carried no liturgical meaning but wove comfort into the air. Others bowed their heads, not in worship but in companionship. And Terra's pulse steadied further, not strong, never strong, but steadier. I rose and walked toward the edge of the plaza where the great fracture cut through the marble. The crack had widened slightly in the last hour, enough for faint warmth to seep upward like breath escaping from a too thin skin. I crouched beside it, letting my fingers hover above the heat. Beneath the warmth was a deeper sensation, something like a tremor of longing, or perhaps a plea. I leaned in closer, closing my eyes. And in that delicate silence, I felt a single, profound truth rise from the depths of the world. Terra does not wish to die alone. A tear slipped down my cheek, surprising me. The darkness caught it before it reached the ground, evaporating it into the night with gentle finality. I whispered to the world again, but this time the words came without conscious thought. We will not leave you. Whether I was speaking for the Pilgrims, for humanity, or only for myself, I could not say. But the planet exhaled weakly, tremulously in answer. The breath rippled through the plaza, stirring the hems of robes, flickering the candles and brushing against the shadows like a sigh of weary gratitude. The night leaned closer still, pressing its cool silence against the feverish stone as though trying to share its calm, its patience, its ancient stillness. And the Pilgrims, sensing something sacred in the quiet, lifted their faces to the sky, not in hope of sunrise, but simply to be present with the world that had carried them for so long. In the distance, far beyond the palace walls, I heard the deep, resonant groan of ancient tectonic plates shifting, a sound like a giant turning in its sleep, uneasy but still alive. Terra was holding on, barely, but holding on, and the darkness, impossibly gentle, held us with it. The whisper arrived at last not as a shout, but as a single, fragile thread of attention that braided itself through the plaza and into the hollow places of people's lives, the spaces where names sleep and the small kindnesses of a lifetime are kept. And when it touched us, it did something neither priest nor prophet could claim to have taught us. It listened back. It did not speak in the clumsy grammar of doctrine or the barked orders of war. It spoke in the grammar of recognition, laying against memory like a fingertip tracing a scar, and asking quietly, patiently, whether the thing beneath the scar still remembered its own name. For a moment, everything stilled as though the world itself leaned forward to hear, and the only sound that mattered was the soft pulse of Terra beneath our boots, the same breath I had learned to feel as the planet exhaled and inhaled in uneven, human rhythms. The whisper folded histories into a single tone, the lamplit room of childhood, the hands that steadied you before duty, the first time a voice called you something tender and private. These were not visions thrust upon us. They were invitations, gifts of recall placed gently on the palms of those willing to accept them. When the thread brushed a man hardened by campaigns, he flinched, and then relaxed as a small tenderness returned to him like temperature restored. The eldest women bowed their heads and let tears run without shame. The children laughed once, surprised as if someone had handed them back a toy they had thought lost forever. It was not only individuals who were touched. The whisper pooled itself into patterns that moved through groups and then across the plaza like a soft wind. A minor chord of relief here, a low, aching minor harmony there, a bright, almost laughing trill when someone recognized a name spoken in its full human shape. Even the shadows, those patient, learning things that had hovered like sentinels through the night, tilted toward the sound and waited as if eager to catalog this new language. But recognition is a dangerous mercy. For every face that softened, there was another that hardened with fear, because to remember is also to choose what to become. In remembering the child inside, one must reckon with the soldier shaped to bury that childhood away. I watched a veteran put his hand to his mouth and not lift it again. I watched a priest narrow his eyes until the flicker of the candlelight reflected nothing but doctrinal certainty. The tech priests, who had measured the outage with auspexes and cold logs, recorded no anomaly capable of naming what had happened in the square that hour. Their instruments could not hold the texture of a mother's whisper, the warmth of a palm on a brow. It was a failure of their science and their faith, but it was not an error of the world. The planet offered its memory in a form older than calculation, and the forms we had trusted to protect us were blind to it. In the center of the plaza, a small knot of people made a decision without words, some to kneel and cradle the names, some to stand and let the recognition pass through them like a current that altered nothing, and some to step away as if retreat were safety. I felt the thread of the whisper comb the edges of my own worn name, and then withdraw, leaving behind a residue as tender as ash. It pressed the shape of what I had been against the shape of what I had become, and asked which I would carry forward. As the whisper moved, an undertone began to hum that felt like something Terra herself added. Not a directive, but a memory that wrapped the recall with context. It threaded into the whisper the sense that the planet had borne us, our griefs, our triumphs, our bargains, for eons, and now, in its weakening, it was giving back what it had kept. The implication was not that Terra required repayment, but that everything given to a living thing accumulates into a kind of conscience, and that conscience now wished to speak. That message softened the first panic of the crowd into a hush edged with awe and an ache of penitence. The pilgrims unclutched rosaries and laid them in the dust as offering and as testament, as if the act of returning something to the ground might not be a surrender but an answer. Small hands passed blankets. Two strangers shared a ration until it was gone. An old woman lifted her face and prayed not for the sun, but for the memory itself to be held without being misused. The whisper encouraged these gestures, did not demand, only showed how the act of remembering could be an act of care when held lightly, without instrument or altar. Yet the priests, who felt their authority eroded by what they could not categorize, moved in their own way to stabilize the disorder. They attempted to fold the phenomenon into rites, to re-explain it as trial or heresy or a test that confirmed what they already believed. They recited litanies with greater volume and marched teams to sweep the plazas for contagion, but their words fell thin against the broader resonance of recognition. Attempts to purge or contain produced only friction. The groupings of people who had let their names stir resisted being organized back into faceless units, and sometimes small violence, an angry shove, a shouted accusation, rippled into the otherwise tender square. The shadows watched these eruptions with something like sorrow. Terra's hush, by contrast, absorbed these spats and returned only the gentle persistence of the whisper, suggesting that memory could be held even in the presence of fear, that to keep a name did not necessarily mean to refuse duty. I found that idea more dangerous than any warlord's edict, because it suggested a freedom that did not rely on a throne's absolution. By the time the whisper had moved across the plaza's stones and into the narrower alleys where the city breathed in a quieter key, something subtle but irrevocable had changed. People no longer folded their names away as cleanly as before. They kept them like stones in pockets, small, private, warm, and those stones altered how they stood, how they spoke, how they touched each other's sleeves in passing. Terra's whisper had not rebuilt the sun, nor had it ended the night, nor had it promised relief beyond this small, stubborn preservation of memory. But in the smallest acts, two hands held for a second longer, a prayer offered with eyes unashamed. I saw a new economy of care being born, and in that economy, the planet and her children shared a fragile contract. She would show what we had given her, and we would not turn those givens into instruments of our own right. The night leaned over the city as it had all along, grave and endless, and the whisper flowed under it, a river of recollection that would continue whether the priests recorded it or not. The whisper faded not because it weakened, but because it had given all it meant to give, and in the hush that followed its departure, the night seemed to gather itself around Terra like a great shroud drawn lovingly over a fevered sleeper. The darkness did not thicken, it softened, settling into the folds of the city with a tenderness I had never imagined darkness could possess. It filled the cracks in the marble, wrapped the spires in quiet, and dimmed the restless thoughts that had gnawed at the minds of pilgrims and priests alike. The world exhaled, long and trembling, the sound carrying not through the air but through the deep bones of the planet, and we felt it in our chests as though the breath had passed through us before rising to meet the sky. It was an exhale of release, not surrender, not the last breath, but the kind taken before sleep finally arrives after too many hours spent fighting it. The pilgrims gathered instinctively in a loose circle near the heart of the plaza. No one led them. No order was issued. They simply drew close, pulled by the same quiet pull that had guided them here in the first place. Some knelt, some sat, Some simply stood with hands gently resting on the shoulders of strangers they had not known the day before. Their names, returned to them by the whisper, glowed softly in their minds, not as burdens but as lanterns, each one a small warmth carried against the vastness of the night. Even the priests, their robes dusty and their voices hoarse, seemed changed. They did not attempt to drown the silence with doctrine. They simply watched, wide-eyed and weary, as though realizing at last that the world beneath them had been speaking for longer than any of their scriptures could remember. I stepped toward the center of the plaza where the great fracture pulsed faintly with Terra's heartbeat. It was slow now, slow in the way exhausted bodies become slow, but it remained steady. I knelt beside it, placing my palm over the warm stone, and waited. I did not speak this time. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Instead, I breathed with the world. Inhale, exhale, shallow though it was, fragile though it felt, and let my own rhythm fall into quiet alignment with Terra's. Around me, the pilgrims breathed with us. A city of lungs finding the same pattern, a world listening to its children breathe in return. And in that small, improbable harmony, something inside the planet loosened, something ancient, something tired. The warmth under my palm shifted, not brightening, not strengthening, but evening out like a fever finally breaking. The heartbeat grew quieter but more rhythmic, no longer stumbling, no longer gasping between beats. It slowed, softened, and settled into a cadence that felt unmistakably like rest. Not death, not the cold descent into nothingness, but rest, the kind that follows centuries of carrying burdens too heavy for any one world to carry. The kind of rest that comes when someone finally whispers, "You may sleep now, you are not alone." Above us, the night leaned down. It felt like a curtain lowering at the end of a long performance, a gentle closing of the world's tired eyes. The shadows that had watched us so patiently drifted inward, encircling the plaza in a ring of soft darkness. They did not threaten. They simply stood watch, guardians of a fragile peace. One of the smaller shadows brushed against my shoulder, light as a sigh, and for a moment I felt something like gratitude radiate from it, as if the night itself thanked us for keeping faith with the world long enough to let it breathe without fear. The pilgrims' quiet movement slowed. Some rested their heads on the laps of others. Some lay on the stone, palms pressed to the ground as if embracing the world they had always taken for granted. A few hummed soft melodies, tuneless, wordless things that rose and fell like lullabies carried across vast distances. The notes blended with Terra's heartbeat until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Even the machinery of the distant manufactorums remained silent, their dormant spirits listening with reverence. The entire world, from the highest spire to the deepest forgotten chamber beneath the palace, seemed to settle into stillness. And as the quiet deepened, I sensed something profound within Terra, an emotional shift so subtle it could have been missed had the night not amplified it like an echo across a canyon. The world was not healed. Its wounds ran too deep, but it no longer felt alone. That loneliness, that immense planetary ache, had been the most destructive force of all. Not the wars, not the pollution, not the spiritual weight of billions of souls, but the isolation of a world that had carried humanity while humanity forgot to carry it in return. Now, for the first time in millennia, it felt us present, truly present. It felt us breathe with it. And in that shared breath, the planet finally allowed itself to rest. I lifted my face to the sky. There was no sunrise. The sun remained hidden behind whatever cosmic veil had drawn this night across the cradle of mankind. But I realized then that sunrise was irrelevant. Light was irrelevant. What mattered was the quiet, this impossible, sacred quiet in which an ancient world finally allowed itself to sleep. Slowly, gently, without fear. Terra's final breath before rest rolled through the plaza like a warm current. It brushed against my cheek, my hands, my armor, and whispered something so soft I could not separate it from my own thoughts. Stay with me. And I did. We all did. The pilgrims curled where they stood or sat or knelt, and the shadows pulled closer, forming a silent perimeter of mourning and protection. The priests lowered their staffs. The city dimmed to absolute stillness. And beneath my hand, the world's heartbeat settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum, slow, peaceful, unburdened. Terra slept. And for the first time in my life, I felt the universe grow quiet enough to let me sleep with her.